I want you to think about the last time you filled up your car. You swiped your credit card. You filled the tank. You paid maybe $3 or $4 a gallon. You might have complained that it was a little expensive. But do you know what actually allows you to do that? Why can the United States, a nation with $30-4 trillion in national debt, still function smoothly? Why can we print money out of thin air to save the banks and save the economy, without the money in your wallet turning into worthless paper like in Zimbabwe or Venezuela? The answer is not gold. It is not technology. The answer lies in a secret deal signed in 1970- for in the Saudi Arabian desert. Welcome to our new investigative series, The Dollar Endgame. Over the next 6 episodes, we are not going to talk about partisan politics. We are going to talk about the only power that really matters, the flow of currency. We are going to decode why Venezuela, the country with the most oil on the planet, became the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And we are going to find out if the dominance of the American empire is coming to an end. Today, in part 1, we start with the invisible engine. To understand what happened to Venezuela, you first have to understand what happened to our dollar. Let's go back to 1970-1. The US was in crisis. The Vietnam War had drained the treasury. President Nixon went on television and did something shocking. He ended the gold standard. Suddenly, the dollar was backed by nothing. It was just paper. Its value began to freefall. Inflation skyrocketed. We needed something to anchor the value of our currency. If not gold, then it had to be something the whole world craved. Something every nation needed to survive. Oil. In 1970-4, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger flew to Saudi Arabia. He offered a historic deal to the royal family. The deal was simple. The US would provide absolute military protection for Saudi Arabia. We would sell you weapons. We would ensure your throne is safe forever. In exchange, Saudi Arabia had to do exactly one thing. They had to price their oil exclusively in US dollars. Not Japanese yen, not German mercs, not gold, only US dollars. And because Saudi Arabia led OPEC, the entire organization followed suit. The Petrodollar System was born. Here is the genius of the system. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be France, China, or Japan. If you want to import oil to run your factories, run your cars, run your economy, you must have US dollars in your hand. How do you get US dollars? You have to export goods to the US. This creates a massive artificial demand for our currency. The whole world became a warehouse for dollars. This allowed Washington to do something no other nation can do: export inflation. When the Federal Reserve prints $1 trillion, that money doesn't just circulate in the US. It flows out to the world, sitting in the reserves of 4 central banks. We trade green pieces of paper for Japanese tea versus German cars and Chinese toys. It is an exorbitant privilege. It is America's economic superpower. But every superpower has a weakness. For this system to survive, all oil-minus rich nations must follow the rules. What happens if a country suddenly decides, I don't want to sell in dollars anymore? If that happens, demand for the dollar crashes. Trillions of dollars overseas would flood back into the US. So protecting the petrodollar is a matter of national security. And this is where Venezuela enters the story. Venezuela is not a normal country. They were a founding member of OPEC. Venezuela possesses the largest proven oil reserves in the world. They sit on a treasure chest big enough to power the world for decades. For years, Venezuela was an obedient cog in the petrodollar machine. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. They started asking questions. Why do we have so much oil, but our people are still poor? And then they made a fatal mistake. A geopolitical calculation mistake. Oil is actually the devil's excrement. In part 2, we are going to look at the insane wealth of Venezuela before the crash. But back in the 1970s, no one in Venezuela thought the well would run dry. And more importantly, no one thought this blessing was actually a death sentence. Welcome to part 2 the resource curse. To understand the current tragedy, you have to understand how rich Venezuela used to be. Here is a fact that surprises many Americans. In 1950, Venezuela was the fourth richest nation in the world. They were richer than China, richer than Japan, richer than Spain. In the 70s, their currency was so strong that Venezuelans were known as the most wasteful consumers in the world. They flew to Miami on weekends just to shop. They were called Damed Os, meaning give me two, because they always bought two of everything: T-verses, cars, fridges. They had the Concorde flying direct from Paris to Caracas. They had the tallest skyscrapers in Latin America. So how does a country that has everything lose everything? It didn't start with socialism. It started with economics. Economists call it the Dutch disease. Imagine you win a $100 million lottery. What is the first thing you do? Chances are, you quit your job. You stop trying. Nations are like people. When Venezuela discovered massive oil reserves, their currency value skyrocketed. Because the currency was so strong, goods made in Venezuela became too expensive to export. Farmers couldn't sell coffee or cocoa abroad. Factories closed. At the same time, because the currency was strong, imports from the US became incredibly cheap. Gradually, Venezuela stopped producing everything. They did exactly one thing: pump oil. And this is when Hugo Chavez stepped onto the stage. When Chavez took power in 1990-9, he got lucky with a second lottery ticket. Global oil prices skyrocketed from $10 to $140 a barrel. From the perspective of an American observer, Chavez did what any populist politician would do: he spent it. He built houses, schools, and subsidized food. Poverty rates dropped. But there was a catch. To fund these social programs, Chavez needed total control over the Golden Goose PDVSA. PDVSA used to be considered the best minus-run oil company in the world after Saudi Aramco. It was run by engineers trained in the US, in Texas, in Oklahoma. Chavez wanted to change that. He wanted to turn PDVSA into the government's piggy bank. In 2002, PDVSA managers went on strike. Chavez responded with an act that shocked the global energy industry. He went on television, blew a whistle, and fired 18,000 PDVSA employees live on air. The brain trust of the Venezuelan oil industry was fired overnight. Who replaced them? Party loyalists. People who knew nothing about operating a complex oil rig. The consequences weren't immediate. The oil kept flowing due to inertia. But the oil industry is incredibly maintenance heavy. Pipes rusted. Pumps failed. Venezuela's oil production began to freefall, from 3.5 million down to 1 million. And then disaster struck. In 2014, oil prices collapsed. When the tide goes out, you discover who has been swimming naked. Venezuela had no savings. They had no agriculture. They had no manufacturing. That was the start of the hyperinflation nightmare: people using money to make origami because it is cheaper than craft paper. But if it was just domestic mismanagement, Venezuela might have become a recessed economy, not a humanitarian disaster. There was a second factor. Venezuela had committed a sin greater than bad economic management. They had dared to challenge the Petrodollar System. They poked the invisible engine, and the engine fought back. In part 3, we are not going to talk about oil anymore. We are going to talk about financial weapons. We have seen how Venezuela shot itself in the foot with mismanagement. But there is a brutal truth in geopolitics: when a beast is wounded, that is, when the hunters pull the trigger. Venezuela committed economic mistakes, but their real sin was that they dared to challenge the power of the dollar. Welcome to part 3, the rebellion, the sanctions. Look at a map of US military bases around South America. You might think the US would send the Marines to topple the Maduro regime, but the 21st century doesn't work like that. Kinetic warfare is expensive. Why send soldiers when you can destroy a nation from an air-conditioned office in Washington, D.C.? The weapon is called SWIFT. Most Americans don't know what SWIFT is. We just swipe our cards. But SWIFT is the bloodstream of global commerce. It allows banks to send money to each other. And even though its headquarters are in Belgium, the reality is that the US Treasury hold the keys. When Venezuela started selling oil and other currencies, Washington decided to pull the plug. In 2019, the US imposed the harshest sanctions in history on the Central Bank of Venezuela. It means Venezuela became a leper in the financial system. Imagine you are an oil trader in India. You want to buy Venezuelan oil. But when you try to wire $50 million to PDVSA, your bank says no. Because if that bank processes the transaction, they will be cut off from the dollar system. The result was total paralysis. The oil was still there, but it was unsellable. And even if they sold it, the money couldn't come back home. A prime example is gold. The Central Bank of Venezuela had about $1 billion in gold stored at the Bank of England. When the crisis hit, they asked to withdraw this gold to buy medicine. The bank said no. That gold was frozen. In the US, Citgo also had its assets frozen. Revenue from selling gas to Americans was no longer sent back to Venezuela. This was a medieval siege, but conducted with digital algorithms. The impact on civilians was catastrophic. No dollars equals no medicine. No spare parts for machines. No food. Inflation hit 1,000,000%. A roll of toilet paper cost a stack of Bolivar bills thicker than a brick. People started losing weight from hunger. They called it the Maduro diet. From the perspective of an American observer, we have to question the efficacy of this strategy. But history shows the opposite. In Cuba and Iran, in North Korea, sanctions do not topple regimes. They only impoverish the middle class. The ruling elite still live comfortably. It even gives the government a perfect excuse the imperialist blockade. But more importantly, weaponizing the dollar had an unintended side effect. When you corner a beast, what does it do? It finds another way out. If they can't use dollars, they will try to create something else. Venezuela became a laboratory for one of the weirdest financial experiments, the petro coin. When you are locked in a room and the main door is bolted by Swift, what do? You try to climb out the window. Venezuela, in its desperate isolation, attempted the most audacious jailbreak in modern financial history. They decided to ditch paper money. They went digital. Welcome to part for the failed escape. In 2018, the world was going crazy for Bitcoin. If the US controls the banks, but no one controls the blockchain, why not use blockchain to sell oil? President Maduro announced the launch of El Petro. On paper, it was a genius idea. The Petro was the world's first sovereign cryptocurrency. Unlike Bitcoin, every Petro token was declared to be backed by 1 barrel of oil. The message was clear by our Petro. It is as good as oil, and the US Treasury cannot block it. Venezuela hoped to raise billions of dollars from international investors. But this escape attempt failed before it even started. Why? First was the issue of trust. Venezuela said the Petro was backed by oil, but who verifies that? You cannot take a virtual Petro coin to a Venezuelan port and demand a physical barrel of oil. The world looked at Venezuela's history of default and said no thanks. Second, and more importantly, was the reaction of the House, the United States. The moment the Petro launched, President Donald Trump signed an executive order. This order banned any US citizen from trading the Petro. Any crypto exchange that listed the Petro would be sanctioned. The Petro died instantly. It became a zombie coin. When the digital window slammed shut, Venezuela turned to the oldest method known to mankind, gold. Venezuela has massive gold reserves in the Orinoco region. Gold does not need Swift. Gold is anonymous money. Journalists started tracking mysterious flights. Russian and Turkish jets landing in Caracas. Tons of gold bars were secretly flown to Turkey, to the UAE. They called it the gold minus for minus food mechanism. But this path was also unsustainable. Industrial gold mining requires machinery and chemicals, which they couldn't import. Second, the US started tightening sanctions on shipping on aviation and shores. Venezuela's efforts were like a drowning man thrashing in the water. The more they struggled, the tighter the noose of the American financial system became. The conclusion from Part 4 is a cold lesson: you cannot beat the house. Technology, crypto cannot save you if you don't have credibility. Resources, gold, oil cannot save you if you don't have access to the market. Venezuela learned the painful lesson that in a unipolar world, isolation means death. But what if the world is no longer unipolar? What if another house appears and opens its doors to Venezuela? In Part 5, we are going to talk about the backyard proxy war. China and Russia enter the chat. In Washington, D.C., there is an unwritten rule that has existed for 200 years. It is called the Monroe Doctrine. The rule is simple: the Western Hemisphere is America's backyard. Any foreign power trying to intervene in South America is considered a direct hostile act. But in our effort to economically strangle Venezuela, we seem to have forgotten our own rule. Welcome to Part 5, the backyard proxy war. When US banks pulled out, a massive power vacuum was created. And who stepped into that void? America's two biggest strategic competitors, China and Russia. They didn't come for kindness. They came for their own national interests. First was China minus the new creditor. While the US used the stick sanctions, China brought the carrot cash. Beijing has lent Venezuela over $60 billion. But the deal was loans minus for minus oil. This means a massive chunk of Venezuela's future oil production already belongs to China. Next was Russia minus the enforcer. Russia's state oil company, Rosneft, pumped cash in to save PDVSA from default. In exchange, Russia gained control over critical oil fields and shares of Citgo. Imagine this: a Russian state company almost owned a piece of critical energy infrastructure right on American soil. That is a national security nightmare for Washington. In 2019, Russian military transport planes landed in Caracas. The message from Moscow was clear: Venezuela is under our protection. From the strategic perspective, did we shoot ourselves in the foot? By isolating Venezuela too aggressively, we pushed them into the arms of our rivals. We turned an old trading partner into a geopolitical outpost for our adversaries. Instead of regime change, it helped the Maduro administration consolidate power. But the winds are shifting. In 2020-6, the world is changing fast. Rise of BRICS. The US still needs global oil price stability, and Washington is starting to realize pushing Venezuela too far might be an irreversible mistake. It is time for Realpolitik. In the final episode, Part 6, we are going to look at the future. Why is Chevron back? In 1970-4, Henry Kissinger created the petrodollar to protect American power. In 2019, Washington used the petrodollar to punish Venezuela. But in 2020-6, the wind has changed, and the United States is proving that we are the most pragmatic nation on earth. Welcome to the finale, the end of the petrodollar. Remember those rusting oil rigs in Venezuela I told you about? Recently, something strange is happening. American engineers are going back. Chevron received a special license from the Treasury Department to return to Venezuela. Why, after years of embargoes and calling them dictators, are we shaking hands again? The answer lies at the gas station down your street. The world in 2020-6 is unstable. Conflict in the Middle East. Global energy supply chains are more fragile than ever. If gas prices in the US hit $6 or $7 a gallon, no president can stay in the White House. Inflation is the #1 enemy of the American voter. So, Washington made a cold calculation: dirty oil is better than expensive oil. We would rather buy oil from Venezuela than let domestic gas prices skyrocket. But this return is not like the old days. The US is back, but the world is different. We are witnessing the first real cracks in the petrodollar system in 50 years. The sanctions sent a chilling message: if you hold dollars, your money can be confiscated. The result? The world is looking for Plan B. The BRICS alliance is rising fast. They are discussing selling oil in yuan, rubles, or a new common currency. Saudi Arabia recently declared they are open to trading in currencies other than the US dollar. What does this mean for Venezuela? Venezuela will never return to the golden age. Those days are dead. The country is now a zombie nation slowly coming back to life. They will sell some oil to the US, some to China, some to India. They are no longer America's exclusive backyard. They are a tug-minus of minus war zone. And what does this mean for us, the American people? The dollar won't collapse tomorrow. It is still the cleanest shirt, but the era where the US can print infinite money is coming to a close. The share of US dollars in global reserves is slowly declining. As the world needs fewer dollars, those excess dollars will come back home. And that means inflation will become a persistent problem. The story of Venezuela is a cautionary tale about hubris. Venezuela was arrogant to think oil would feed them forever. And America was arrogant to think the world would accept the dollar forever. History teaches us no empire lasts forever, and no currency is king forever. This has been Project 1%. Subscribe to prepare for the new world order.